All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I know it can be challenging to find some time to attend webinars like this. So I really appreciate you making some time for us today. My name is Brett Gillett. I'll be walking through the slides. And today we're going to talk about, I think, one of what we'll call must-have services in Amazon. It's AWS Config. This is meant to be a high-level introduction. So that's why we've titled it Getting Started. We've actually got quite a number of topics to get through here in a short period of time. We're going to start just with my definition of what AWS Config is. We're going to look at some important terms and concepts. One of the most challenging aspects, I think, of config is just understanding some of the general concepts, the terms that you're going to run into as you're getting started. So we'll cover those. We'll talk also about what does AWS Config support, where is it available. Identity and access management, obviously something that's super important. How do we properly secure our environments? We'll talk specifically here about how do we use IAM as it relates to the config solution. We'll look briefly at AWS organizations. We'll look at the options that you have when setting up a config deployment, and then kind of get into, I think, kind of the real meat of this is config rules, automatic remediation, and something new called Conformance packs. So lots of ground to cover here. So here's the definition that I like to use for AWS config. If you think back, to ITIL days, we talked a lot about a configuration management database, or a CMDB. I really view the config solution as a CMDB for AWS. What it's going to allow us to do once we've enabled it is just understand what's in our account, uh, who or what is making changes to those items within our account. It's a fantastic troubleshooting tool. It's a fantastic tool that you can use to satisfy audit requirements. And this is one of the reasons why we call it a must-have AWS service. Let's start with some general terms and concepts that you're going to run into as you deploy AWS config in your environment. The first, kind of the base building block, is a configuration item, a CI. All this is a single point in time view of a resource that is being monitored by your config deployment. I kind of think of it as, you can almost think of it as a balance sheet, right? At that moment in time, this is the status of, in this case, the resource. And I know the screenshot's a little small, but what I'm highlighting here is a particular moment in time, April 9th, 2018, at a specific moment, right? 7-ish a.m. in the morning or 8 a.m. in the morning, we've got something happening to an S3 bucket in this account. Another really important concept with AWS config is what's called the configuration history. The configuration history is, I think, a really important concept within the config solution, and the fact that it allows us to visualize the changes of monitored resources over time. In this example, I've taken the last screenshot and just unhighlighted it for you here. You can see exactly what's happened to this S3 bucket the moment it was created, right back in, I think that says August 20th in 2018, and the changes that occurred to it during its lifespan. In this screenshot, you don't see it, but you could click on those configuration items in the history view here and get additional information, basically metadata, what changed, who did it, relationships that exist between this S3 bucket and other resources within your AWS account. And this is why I think that it's a super important tool. I'll give you a great example. We were working with a customer and they asked us to do some cleanup on security groups. They knew they had a lot of orphan security groups in their environment, but they didn't quite know exactly where to start. Right. And you obviously want to be very careful here. You don't want to be removing or changing security groups that are actually in use. So we use the configuration history and configuration items in their config deployment to look for security groups that had no relationships. And then we were able to use this screen, drill down, get the IDs, and make our change records based off of those IDs. The configuration recorder is the main component of a config implementation. This is the piece of software or the part of the service that is actually recording the configurations of the AWS resources that the config service supports within your AWS account. When you get started, this is really the first thing you're going to do. You're going to turn on that recorder service. Configuration stream. A configuration stream is really just a list of all the configuration items and the changes that are occurring to those items over time. We're going to come back to the configuration stream a little later when we walk through kind of the setup of a config deployment, the options that you have when you set up a config deployment. The configuration stream is going to come back up. So just for now, think of it as an ordered list, a configuration or a list of the configuration items in your account and the changes that are occurring to them. Once you have config up and running, it's fantastic to know what's in your account, the relationships to those items, right? This EC2 exists in this subnet, in this VPC. It has these security groups associated with it. That's great information, right? For the reasons that I mentioned already, we can drill down, do some troubleshooting, satisfy audit requirements. The real power here, though, comes from ensuring the proper configuration, ensuring compliance, security compliance within your account. And config can help you with that through something called a configuration rule. And we'll dive into these in much more detail later on. Ultimately, what this is a way for you to monitor for the desired configuration of resources in your account. It's quite common now for customers, even smaller customers, to have what is called a multi-account deployment. And how you decide to break up your accounts is ultimately up to you. Some common examples would be maybe by department, by project, by environment. Our recommendation to customers when we talk about a multi-account deployment, it's really structured around ultimately how are you going to pay for the service, right? It's probably one of the most simple ways to alleviate some of the complexity around billing in your AWS environment. You'll end up with a single bill from Amazon within a multi-account deployment. And now I've got a breakdown, let's say by department, right? Finance spent this, marketing spent that, the internal IT resources spent that. What config is able to do is exist within that multi-account deployment by using something called aggregation. And what it does is once it's configured, it simply consolidates all the configuration information into a single AWS account. We would often set this up, what we would call a security account, and all those config logs flow back into that environment. All of the config rules and the compliance status of those rules flows back into that security account. Currently, the config solution is supported in all of the commercial regions, as well as the 2 GovCloud regions that exist in the US region. So I think it's GovCloud East and GovCloud West. So 20 or 22 regions are supported. If you wanted to have a look at more detail around the global infrastructure, the products, the services that are supported in those regions, there's a link here at the bottom of the slide so you can get the most current information. But for config, know that it's supported in all those commercial regions. When we created this slide deck, there was support for 30 different AWS services within the AWS config solution. So by no means is this going to cover everything in your AWS account, but ultimately, we used it actually just today to understand some changes that had happened in an account around a security group. We wanted to work backwards and see what happened. A couple weeks ago, we used it to understand why a code deploy implementation had stopped working. And what we did was we used the EC2 components that we were recording within config, look back, see what had changed, and work backwards from there to resolve the issue to figure out why deploy wasn't working the way we expected. So it doesn't support everything at this point, but it does support kind of what I'll call the most common services in your environments. So that's a little bit about high level terms, concepts, support for services and regions. I could have put this slide. I recreated it a couple times, and I ended up just consolidating it into one environment or to one slide. Sorry, we're going to show throughout this webinar screenshots, and obviously we're using the management console for that. if we were doing this for a customer, what I'll say in real life, we wouldn't be configuring and maintaining the AWS config solution through the management console. In our case, we would actually be using CloudFormation or scripting or a combination of both in order to deploy and maintain that solution as code in an automated manner within that customer's environment. Having said that, you have flexibility. Right? Whether you're creating, managing, monitoring through the management console, you can do that. You can use one of the Amazon provided SDKs and now create your own programmatic interface to config. And you can run simple CLI commands as well to pull this information out. Okay, so flexibility when it comes to both accessing the config solution as well as maintaining that config solution over time. Ultimately, I would say that you should work towards some automated mechanism to do this. Ultimately, that's up to you. As is the case with most AWS services, there are a number of factors that actually influence the total cost of a config deployment. I've included the link to the latest pricing here, but so please always check before any implementation. Make sure you understand the cost ramifications of the changes that you may decide to make within your environment. Generally, we're going to say the number of configuration items or CIs that exist within your deployment affect the cost. The rules and the number of evaluations of those rules affect the cost. Conformance packs, which we're going to talk about a little later, very similar to rules in the fact that every time we evaluate a conformance pack, there's going to be a charge for that. And then we've got a number of supporting services, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. The simple storage service, the simple notification service, and even potentially Lambda, depending on what it is that you're doing. Okay, so 3 components related directly to the service. And then what I would say is you have additional costs for supporting services, whether it's storage, notification, or automation. Identity and access management, or IAM, we spend a lot of our time thinking about and working on the identity and access management solution for our customers. So I'm going to start here and talk a little bit about how to ensure the proper security of a config deployment. And the first place that we're going to start is with your identity and access management users. Okay? And remember, just to be very clear here, a user doesn't necessarily have to be a person. A user could be, Joe in the IT department logging in, could also be an application. Okay? What we're going to say here for IAM users is always practice least privilege. Okay? Start potentially with an AWS managed policy. If you're not familiar with a managed policy, this is simply an IAM policy that's created and maintained on our behalf by AWS. Okay? Great starting point. But what I find is in most situations, we may want something just a little different than that managed policy. Starting with a managed policy, though, is a great way to just alleviate some of that heavy lifting. You don't have to build it from scratch. Grab that JSON file and then modify it for what you need. Now, you can't modify the actual managed policy. You're going to basically pull it out of AWS, put it in the JSON editor, make the changes, and then upload it back into AWS as what's called a customer managed policy. Like I mentioned with config, our recommendation is don't manage IAM through the management console. You would, again, want to use some sort of programmatic mechanism, whether it's infrastructure as code like CloudFormation or some third-party tool. You don't want to have to manage this by hand, because what we find is that the administration curve kind of takes that hockey stick shape when we talk about IAM. And it'll sneak up on you very quickly, where you end up spending a lot of your time administrating the proper configuration of IAM. One last thing I would say about practice least privilege. We actually remember that by default, IAM denies all activity. Okay. We actually start with that policy, knowing full well that when we try to do something, we're going to get an error. Okay. We're not going to talk about it in this webinar, but CloudTrail is another one of what we'll call our must-have services. And CloudTrail will record all those API calls that are being made. What we would do is we would create a group with a policy associated to that group that provides our users with access to the AWS config solution. knowing full well that basically there's no permissions assigned to that group. Okay? And then we're going to work with those users, and they're going to go ahead and try to do the things that they need to do in config. And we're going to work through that. It's a little bit of a slog at the beginning to get it done, but now we know that we have exactly the permissions that we need in order to provide access to the service so our users can do their jobs, but nothing else. So this is why we often say, a config deployment works really well with a CloudTrail deployment, because now I can use CloudTrail to understand the API calls and work backwards. Just this morning, we were working with a customer, and we practiced this within our own customer accounts. And the user came back and said, hey, I tried to make a change to a security group. I have an error. We went to CloudTrail, found it, modified the policy. We would approach it the same way for IAM users that are accessing the config solution. So always start with least privilege. Don't make everybody an administrator. Okay, it'll come back to get you later on. Now, within the config deployment, config needs to talk to other AWS services. Right? It needs to be able to discover those services, run describe commands against those services to understand the configuration of those services. In order to do that, it uses what's called an IAM role. And this is how it's making API calls and discovery calls against the services that are supported. How the config role gets created is dependent on how you deploy config. If you deploy config through the management console, it will automatically create the role as part of that deployment process. Okay? During that setup, you'll actually see a little notification that pops up that says, hey, do you want us to create this role? And you say yes, and you can keep going. If you deploy config in any other way, you need to create that role yourself. Amazon has very good documentation about the creation and the permissions that are required in this IAM role. So you can just find that in the documentation. What we would normally do is take that documentation, put it into CloudFormation, create the role, which you can see right here, right? And then during the deployment of config, which again, we're going to do programmatically, we tie that config implementation back to the role that we created in an earlier CloudFormation template. So just for now, know that the IAM role is used to communicate with other services. It's created automatically if you deploy through the management console. Otherwise, you have to create it and associate it with your config deployment. Another really important aspect of a config implementation is, where does all of the snapshot information get stored? You can configure an S3 bucket. And again, depending on how you deploy the config service, the bucket policy that's associated with the S3 bucket that you're going to use for your config deployment may be updated on your behalf. So if you're going through the management console, again, it's going to do it for you. Any other way, you're going to have to basically create that S3 bucket, use the AWS documentation to understand the bucket policy that you need to assign to that bucket, and then make that change. Okay, so I'm showing here that we've got a bucket in our AWS, in our local AWS account, and then you can see the reference to the bucket and the prefix or the path that we're going to use in that bucket when we're going to store configuration information in that S3 bucket. Okay. You can also see here in the delivery method, you can have the config service create that bucket on your behalf. And I mentioned already that in many cases, our recommendation is to create a multi-account deployment. And you would have a standalone AWS account, let's call it our security account again. And you can see here our additional option to choose a bucket that exists in another AWS account. And then finally, the simple notification service, or SNS. SNS allows us to generate notifications when certain activities occur or certain activities are captured by our config deployment. Remember when I said in the terms and concepts, I talked about the configuration stream? Essentially what we do is we connect that configuration stream to the SNS solution. And any changes that happen flow through SNS, and we generate our notifications. If you're not familiar with SNS, it's a simple pub sub or publish subscribe service. What we would have is basically the AWS config solution is a publisher. It publishes a message to the SNS topic. The SNS topic immediately fans it out across all of the subscribers of that topic. The one thing that I would just make sure that you are aware of here is potentially this could generate a lot of notifications. You may want to think about what is the configuration and where are the destinations that you configure for these messages, the configuration stream messages. You may end up creating yourself a ton of email, right? If you say, hey, just subscribe me to this via my email address, you may end up with a lot of emails. So think about what this looks like, think about what you actually require, and then make those decisions. In the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the actual kind of setup of config, enabling different features within config. And I mentioned already that config is supported across all 22 regions, including our 2 GovCloud regions here in North America. I do always like to just kind of go a little deeper and add an additional caveat here that says, when you decide to deploy this, make sure that you validate the features we're going to look at are available in each region. Okay? So the service might be available, config might be available, but one of the features that we're going to show here may not be. So just knowing that config's available in region A isn't enough. You would want to look at, prior to deploying the solution, the features that you intend to use and make sure that the features are actually supported in the region as well. It's something that when I first got started on the AWS platform, I learned the hard way a couple times. We're like, oh, well, service A is available. And we would go down the path and deploy service A. And a month in, we would want to enable a new feature, and that feature wasn't available in that region yet. So just do some due diligence prior to deploying anything really, config or one of the other 170-ish services on the platform. Here's where we're going to talk about actually setting up a config deployment. Okay? I mentioned a couple times, I hope you realize now how important I think this is. Just validate your regions. Okay, and decide on what your config deployment is going to look like. In kind of a perfect world, we would deploy configuration across all supported regions, whether you are using those regions or not. Okay? The goal of that is that if something were to happen in a region, let's say you're in the Canadian region and you expect only services in the Canadian region. But somebody, maybe makes a mistake, let's say, and stands up an EC2 in, I don't know, one of the European regions. Config could see that occur, right? But only if config is enabled in that region. It is a regional service. So you're going to have to decide where you want to deploy this. Best practice would say enable config in every AWS region. Okay? At a minimum, what we would say is, a lot of our customers will say, well, we have these 3 primary regions that we're going to use, CA Central, US East 1, and US West 1. And they'll say it must be on in those 3 regions, what I'll call our primary regions. We're not going to enable it in the other regions. This is a decision that you'll have to make when you're deploying this solution. Okay, so at a minimum, cover the regions that you're operating in. In a perfect world, you'd actually enable it for all AWS regions. Excuse me. When you deploy, you're going to have to, one of the early steps is tell the config solution which services you want to monitor. And generally, we would say you should just say monitor everything. Okay? All services. The one kind of gotcha or exception for that implementation idea is if you were deploying across multiple regions, what you'll find is that one of the options is to have config record global resources. And a good example of global resources would be something we talked about already, right? Resources that you create in an IAM deployment. Excuse me, in your IAM deployment. You probably don't want, or you don't need to record those in every single region. So if I go back to my example, and just to keep it simple, let's say I have a customer that says we're going to use CA Central 1, US East 1, and US West 1. We would say, okay, let's make in CA Central 1, we're going to record all resources as well as the global resources. In US East 1 and US West 1, we would not record global resources. Okay? Otherwise, we're recording them multiple times. Doesn't make sense to do that. I showed you already the process of configuring S3. You have to figure out what this configuration looks like. Is it in your account? Is it another AWS account? Is that a bucket that already exists, right? Whether it's in your account or another bucket, or are you just going to let the config service create that bucket for you? What the S3 service is used for is all the configuration history and what's called a configuration snapshot. Okay. I actually didn't have a slide for configuration snapshot. I'm just noticing that now as I look at this slide. A snapshot is basically, well, a point in time look at everything that exists in that config deployment. And you can configure this. It's not enabled by default, but you could turn on a configuration snapshot and decide how often you want that snapshot to be created. And you could say every 24 hours, every 12 hours. That's up to you to decide. And when that snapshot occurs, the data that is captured as part of that snapshot is stored in the S3 bucket. Mentioned SNS already. Okay. Just remember here that you potentially could generate a lot of notifications. So make sure you understand what you're creating and exactly what's going to flow through it. Like we had on the previous slide, you can have the AWS config deployment create a new SNS topic as part of the deployment process, or selecting an existing topic that you may already have. And then finally, once we've got that deployed, we have an opportunity to actually create, or I shouldn't say create, enable configuration rules. And we're going to come back to config rules here again in a minute. A multi-region, multi-account deployment, I've mentioned kind of in a roundabout way a couple times here. This is all about, if you've got that kind of multi-account deployment, basically ensuring that config is enabled across every region, across every account, so that you have a complete picture of all of the information that, or all the resources that exist across those accounts. And this is where the aggregator comes in that we talked about a little earlier on. What you do is, in the account that you decide to be your central account, you create the aggregator. Okay? And then that aggregator allows us to pull in information from individual AWS accounts. Now, I mentioned in the intro that we're going to talk a little bit about organizations. If you're not familiar with organizations, this is a service that AWS created a number of years ago that is meant to alleviate some of the administrative burden around the creation and management of a multi-account deployment. And what we're seeing is, increasingly, services are what I'll call AWS organizations aware. And the config solution is one of those organizationally aware services. It used to be that when you created the aggregator, you only had an option where you had to go in and add the individual accounts. Okay. Now what you can do is you can just create an aggregator for the entire organization. So every AWS member account will automatically be aggregating its information through that config aggregator. So you can see in our example here, I've named it just our centralized config aggregator, and it's associated with 7 accounts. In this particular deployment, we went down the individual account path. There's a number of reasons why you may want to do that. I won't get into it today, but we decided to go down the individual account path. Once you have that aggregator enabled and you've assigned your accounts to it, you actually have to basically authorize that aggregator. And what this allows it to do is basically account A is now allowing the aggregator to gather up all of the information that is collected within AWS Config and centralize it in that single AWS account. If you go down the organization's deployment path, you don't actually need to authorize the aggregator. It's done at the organization's level. In our example here, where we've got these 7 individual accounts, we had to go to each of those accounts. We did this programmatically again, but we had to go to each of those accounts and authorize the aggregator. If you don't do this, you won't actually get information from that account. Okay. And remember, again, one of the things that we see customers run into every once in a while is they're like, well, I authorized the aggregator and I still don't have information. It's a regional service. You actually have to make sure that you have the authorization for the aggregator in each region. I mentioned config rules a couple times, so let's talk about these again. A config rule is, as I mentioned earlier on, it's the desired state. I want our environment, let's say EBS volumes within our environment, to always be encrypted. You can use a config rule to ensure that that happens. Okay? And as soon as you have AWS config up and running and you've enabled at least a single config rule, what you'll see is this compliance view. Okay, so I've got 12 non-compliant rules and 12 compliant rules in this environment. It also breaks it down by compliant and non-compliant resources. So I can drill down into these to see specific information. And down here, what we're showing is the non-compliance rule by resource count. So I can see here that Security Hub is one of those other services that we would call must-have. And Security Hub, when it's enabled, will actually create its own config rules. In this situation, we've got a couple S3 buckets without logging enabled. Okay. So it's highlighting that as a failed or a non-compliant config rule. And this is right in the main dashboard of the config service. If you think back to early in the slides, we talked about how to access information, management console, SDK, or CLI. You can get all of this programmatically as well. There are 2 types of config rules that you can create. AWS managed rules, very similar to AWS managed policies that we talked about before. You basically just find the rule that you want, you enable it, and you can configure it. Okay, you can't modify what that rule does because it's created and maintained by AWS on our behalf. But as an example, I think I have a slide here that I'm stealing from myself, but I'll mention it now. A great config rule that you can use in your environment is to monitor for the age of access keys. So if you're not familiar, an access key is basically, I think this is an overgeneralization, but it works for me. Basically a login and a password that you could use to programmatically access your AWS environment. The challenge that a lot of customers have is there's no automated mechanism to force the rotation of those access keys. What you could use is an AWS managed rule that monitors the age of the access key. And when you deploy that, what you'll find in there is the option to determine when you want to consider that access key to be non-compliant. So the default is 90 days. You could adjust that. So this is the idea of created by AWS, but configurable by us. The other type of config rule is a customer managed rule. You want to do something that doesn't exist in the AWS managed rule set, you can create your own config rule. And essentially what happens here is you integrate it with a Lambda function. The Lambda function is the actual mechanism or the tool that you'll use to evaluate the status of those resources. Don't create a customer managed rule until you're sure it doesn't exist in the AWS managed space. Okay. It used to be that when config first came out, there were very few managed rules. There are a ton now across almost all of the supported services. So just spend a few minutes, have a look through that, find the ones that make sense for you, and start with those AWS managed rules first. Okay. No sense in reinventing the wheel. Once you've decided on the config rules that you're going to use, you have to decide how you want the AWS config solution to trigger the usage of those rules. And we have 2 options. We have basically a triggered situation where an event, something happens in our environment, triggers the evaluation of that rule. Great example is tagging. A new EC2 instance comes to life. You could trigger the tagging config rule to say, do these 4 tags exist? The other option you have is a periodic evaluation. So this is kind of like cron. Every 24 hours, check this. Every hour, check that. And it's not one or the other. You can configure rules to look for specific events occurring and evaluate, but then also run every X number of hours. Oh, one other thing I should mention, when we're talking here about creating customer managed rules, you can do this just by scratch, right? You can go in and you can create everything and create the Lambda function and away you go. Amazon also has what's called the config development kit. No, config rule development kit, I think it is. So I think it's called CRK. If you just Google AWS config rule development kit, it'll drop you right into it. It's an open source solution that just simplifies the creation of customer managed rules. One of the biggest benefits of a platform like AWS is because it's software based, it can be highly automated. It's one thing to tell me that something isn't compliant in my environment, but I don't want to wait for a person to log in and fix that, right? It's kind of, a lot of times it's what I'll call grunt work, right? You got to go in and you modify a configuration or something like that of, let's say in that one screenshot, I didn't have logging enabled on my S3 bucket. Yes, you can have a person go in and do that work for you, but now we have the ability to use remediation. Remediation is really just about automation. We can tie remediation remediation actions, I should say, to our rules. And when we find something that's non-compliant, we can execute something, okay, to take action on our behalf. A really simple example that we built for one customer was we had an AWS config or an AWS managed config rule that looked for the password policy and made sure the password policy said you can only have a password that's 60 days old, has to be 14 characters, all that kind of good stuff. And instead of generating a notification to somebody to say, hey, the password policy in account A doesn't adhere to your requirements, we actually use config remediation. And config remediation uses another must-have service called AWS Systems Manager. It uses what are called automation documents. And the way that I like to think of an automation document really is just a list of instructions that I want to follow on my behalf. So in our case, with this really simple example, we have a periodic check in config to evaluate the password policy in the account, and we've configured the settings of that password policy, right? It has to be 14 characters, has to have an uppercase character, whatever the requirements are. And instead of generating a notification, if you were to change that and say, well, you can make a password that's only 7 characters long, when we see that change, or when we check for that change, we invoke an automation document. The automation document executes a Lambda function. Really simple example. The Lambda function makes an API call to the IAM service and says, this is what that password policy should look like. And it reverts it back to the standard. Okay. This is a really important part of automation when it comes to compliance and remediation within your AWS accounts. And it's supported both by AWS managed rules and customer managed rules. So my example of a password policy, that's an AWS managed rule. We extended the functionality by using remediation. Another really important feature now is what's called a conformance pack. A conformance pack really is just a template that you use to deploy a collection of rules, remediation actions across multiple accounts, regions, or AWS organizations. It's a YAML template. Okay? To me, when I look at it, it looks basically like a CloudFormation template. So instead of having to create that in individual CF templates or doing it by hand, you can create a conformance pack and then deploy that conformance pack through the CLI across multiple AWS accounts across multiple regions, or through an organization's deployment to ensure that every implementation of config looks exactly the same. Okay. And that wraps up our introduction to the AWS config service. You can follow me on Twitter if you're interested in that kind of thing. You can have look for me on LinkedIn. But that's the content for today. So I want to say thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate you finding the time to sit down and listen to us talk about AWS config. If you're not running AWS config in your account, I can't emphasize enough the importance of running it in your account. Help you with troubleshooting, help you with security audits. You could use this information to at least help you get started. Okay, so thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? You should have a Q&A panel there. If you would like to ask a question about any of the content, we can handle that now. Everybody's good? All right, folks. Well, thank you again very much for attending today. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll be doing another one of these webinars in March. I'm not quite sure where February has gone at this point, but probably around the third week of March, we're going to go back and talk about another must-have tool. We're most likely going to spend our time in March talking about CloudTrail. So hope to see you then. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your week. Thanks very much again. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.